I don't have a half-hour speech, which you're probably blessed for, but I am thrilled to be a small part of the Carter School and this celebration of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter's two great Americans still alive. When I grew up, I wanted to be Jimmy Carter. He's done so much, and their commitment to peace, diplomacy, advancing our shared humanity at every opportunity. Of all the things that Jimmy Carter's done, the two that I keep most close to my heart was that he was really the first president that made human rights the centerpiece of his foreign policy with Zbigniew Brzezinski. And it's come and gone with presidents after him, but for the first time, we stood up and said, human rights is going to define our American role in the world. The other is, if we'd only listened to him on the environment and on energy all those years ago, we'd be in a very different place right now, a very different world. We're now here, I'm sure you've talked about this off and on all day, with the Hamas attack on October 7th and what that means for diplomacy and the enormous challenges that come from that. I think half of the op-eds over the weekend, I think I read at least 12, about how we needed to approach it, how we had to share the outrage at the absolute terrorism and the bloodthirst of Hamas, and at the same time recognize that 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza are not all responsible for what Hamas does. And how do they root out Hamas and still respect the human rights of the innocents that are there? Very difficult balance for everyone, especially in, a country the size of Manhattan, or northern Gaza the size of Manhattan, the rest of it, the 5 boroughs. It's a very difficult time. And President Carter and his example and his words, I hope, will guide our decisions, our adjustments. Let me just quote, you've probably heard this all today, that he stated, quote, "Our policy is based on a historical vision of Americans' role. Our policy is derived from a larger view of global change. Our policy is rooted in our moral values, which never change. And our policy is reinforced by our material wealth and by our military power, and our policy is designed to serve mankind." And I don't know that that's always been true of our foreign policy or our policies in general, but still, it's what we have to live up to. I'm so glad you had my uncle Jerry Connolly here today. Jerry is brilliant and a great public servant and a good foreign policy expert. All those years serving on that Senate foreign policy thing, I'm glad that he was able to give you the insight on the accords back with the Camp David. Amazing stuff. But I thought the most relevant thing that I could do, since I was at Camp David with Jerry Connolly, was to tell you about my 4 years in Switzerland, which was interesting. I'm a car dealer by profession, although my mother didn't call it a profession. But so I was thrilled, and I unexpectedly, I hoped to be a deputy assistant undersecretary of something at Commerce, and when the White House called and said, "We'd like you to go to a mountainous country with lots of guns and lots of chocolate," my wife's first thought was, Afghanistan doesn't have guns and chocolate, do they? So we got to go to Switzerland, and frankly, most of that 4 years was working on bank secrecy, bank geheimnis. This is the time when UBS had at least 50,500 American accounts with more than $1 million in it. And while we went after UBS, they moved all the money to Credit Suisse, and so we went after them again. But the most interesting parts and the most fulfilling parts were the actual doing Carter-like diplomacy. And let me give you 4 examples, actually 7 examples. Number one, one of the challenges we had, especially in the early years of Jimmy Carter, was closing Guantanamo. In fact, my penultimate chief of staff was his Guantanamo spokesperson. Talk about a thankless job. However, as a quick aside, she just got confirmed as the first woman deputy secretary of the VA, Tanya Bradser. So we're all reveling in our family success. But when I got to Switzerland, one of the challenges was we had asked Switzerland and 30 other countries during the Bush administration if they would take 2 of the Uyghurs who'd been arrested in Afghanistan, captured in Afghanistan, but determined by the Bush administration that they were not terrorists, they were not problems for the world. In fact, one of them with a mental illness had gone to Afghanistan from, however you say that, where the Uyghurs live. And his mother had sent the other one to go get him, the brother to go get him and bring him back because they knew he was a little mentally off. The day their brother gets him, we were paying $500 per terrorist that the locals turned in. So who better to turn in than some Uyghurs who were friends or neighbors from Afghanistan? So they're both turned in, captured by us, taken to Guantanamo. Took a number of years for us to determine that they were not, in fact, terrorists. But what we mostly did with Guantanamo people whom we decided to release was repatriate them. You could not repatriate these 2 Uyghurs to China because they would have been killed right away. It was very obvious. And every country that we went to try to take the Uyghurs, China would then call them up and say, if you do, it's going to affect our economic relationship. They basically threatened country after country after country, which they did to Switzerland too. And so I was working really hard as the America's messenger to get the federal council to take these 2 Uyghur young men. By the way, Switzerland is the only country in the world that doesn't have a head of state, a president, a chief of staff, whatever. Their 7-person federal council is their head of state, and they have to all 7 to be together, which is why I had no security, because when they said we get security, they said we don't even protect our own president. Why would we protect you? So we went to the federal council, and they turned us down. They said, they didn't say it, but implicated was they didn't want to jeopardize all of their trade with China. However, in the course of the conversations, one of the things, every ambassador reflects their own background. So as a grassroots politician / car salesman, our background was to go everywhere and meet everybody. And so I spent a lot of time in this, the 26th of the 26 cantons, Gerard. It's a little French-speaking part of what was Canton Bern, up in the far northeastern part. Famous only for Louis Chevrolet was born and raised there. And that's where they started. The French Huguenots who fled the religious persecution came there to build watches, which is where the Swiss watch started. But it's really small, 30,000 people, and very in the poorest of the cantons. So surprisingly, after talking with them, their little 5-person cantonal government voted unanimously to take these 2 Uyghur young men. And it made headlines throughout Switzerland. It embarrassed the federal council into saying, well, I guess if you're going to take them, we'll do it. They flew them over. We had to land in the middle of the night so that no pictures could be taken. And the last time I checked, they had Swiss passports, Swiss jobs, and Swiss girlfriends. And it was a wonderful part of taking the Jimmy Carter, Rosalynn Carter idea of working together peacefully to actually change a couple of people's lives. And that's still hanging out there. A second great example was the OSCE. And don't ask me what it stands for, but Jim Gilmore, who beat me in the election, was ambassador of the OSCE in the Trump administration. And I forget there's who's now, but it's the organization of Southern. Thank you very much, very much. And sadly, in 2011, 2012, not far after the Kosovo stuff, Serbia was next in line to chair the OSCE. And we all decided that was a really bad idea, especially because the Kosovo stuff was too. So they came to me, who went to Switzerland, and said, how would you like to jump in line and chair the OSCE next year in order to keep Serbia from doing it, but not to diss Serbia, just to say that it's going to be postponed a year until the Kosovo stuff settled down. And it took a lot of negotiation, but once again, it was a very Carter-ish type thing to do, was to create an atmosphere where everybody won and nobody lost, and you move forward. Another fun example for me was once again, Al mentioned that Liechtenstein and Switzerland were his favorite companies. They were favorite companies for the State Department too, because at one time, back when we liked Russia, back when we wanted Russia, we had this wonderful naive idea, which I still cling to, that by admitting them into the world economic system, we would liberalize them and make them more democratic and bring them into the community of Europe and the United States. So they did not belong to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, 2010, 2011. And they really desperately wanted to begin to take advantage of all the trade rules. But any bordering country that was part of the WTO had veto rights over another country getting it. And in this case, Georgia, which had been invaded by Russia, and was always the fights over the two breakaway reasons, had said absolutely not. So once again, they called Switzerland, who said, how would you like to negotiate this on our behalf? Because it can't be the United States negotiating between Georgia and Russia. And once again, in classic Jimmy and Rosalynn style, they had the long conversations. It took about 2 years, and Georgia ultimately withdrew its objection, and Russia is now in the WTO. Now, until the invasion in Ukraine. But it was the right thing to do, and it was part of the overall diplomatic perspective. And then the most relevant example, of course, is Iran. Iran, going back to 1979, 1980, when our embassy was invaded and the Shah took over, or the Shah left and the Ayatollah took over, the Switzerland has been our Swiss protecting power. They were also our protecting power in Cuba, but we also had an embassy in Cuba, so it really didn't make any difference there. It made a huge difference in Iran because we had nobody there. Ambassador Olivia Loy had the huge, wonderful responsibility of living in Tehran, coming back and forth to Switzerland every 2 months to report on it and representing us, and specifically representing the American citizens who are still living there. The biggest challenge was the three hikers who were actually hiking on the Iraq border, and went to talk to some guards that they saw, and they said, well, this is Iran. And they moved back into Iraq and then were kidnapped in Iraq by the Iranian guard, brought them back into Iran and held them as hostages for years. That never actually got resolved until I was gone. And it got resolved by the Sultan of Oman paying $500,000 bail for each one of them, which he's never going to get back. However, what was relevant while I got there was that Switzerland at the time, 2009, 2012, was the hole in the donut in Europe in terms of the EU sanctions and the UN sanctions. They never did agree to the EU sanctions, but they weren't even agreeing to the UN sanctions. So this is where Iran was trading all of their oil. They came to do it in Zurich and in Geneva. This is where they're doing all their banking in Geneva. And this is where they were arranging for their centrifuges to be purchased. They weren't actually coming from Switzerland. They were coming from other Eastern European countries, but they're arranged by Swiss business people. And the number one job that we had at our embassy was to close those three parts of the donut holes, which means lots and lots of visits from big shots from State Department and Treasury and Commerce, talking with the Swiss Federal Council, lots and lots of interesting meetings. But by the end, when I left in June of 2013, no oil was being traded there by Iran. The centrifuges were on their way to Gaddafi. And if you really read your intel closely, you figure out we intercepted the ship. And that was why Gaddafi decided to give up his nuclear weapon ambitions, and everything has happened since then. And the most telling part was by the end, I was getting beat up by their Minister of Finance about how deeply the Iranians were complaining that they had nowhere to cast their paychecks because we had so much shut them down. I bring all this up because that was the last piece in getting in the 3+3 process at the P5+1, getting Iran to the table to negotiate the JCPOA, the Joint Committee of Principle of Action, whatever, which I strongly supported. And I do think Donald Trump, whom I didn't support, every president makes a number of mistakes. I'm not sure whether the biggest one was pulling out of the Paris Agreement on the environment or pulling out of the JCPOA. But in the JCPOA, we had Iran 10 to 12 years away from making a nuclear weapon, and now it's 10 to 12 weeks and getting closer all the time. We still very much hope that they won't do it. I know that Blinken and the president and others have tried really hard to rebuild it. My Republican pals' criticism has always been, you address nuclear weapons for, not forever, but for 10 or 12 years. And you didn't address their support for Hezbollah and Hamas and the other nasty things they're doing around the world, the Houthis. But the reality is my dad used to say, you never go broke taking a profit. You get the win you can win and then move on rather than getting nothing at all, which is what we're going to get. Thank you. So that was still probably the most fulfilling thing, that was getting the JCPOA done with the little part that Switzerland had to contribute to it. But then I get to come back here and run for Congress, and you get the same amazing Carter-ish type opportunities all the time. Last year we've been working for years to get one of the political prisoners in Egypt out. He's been in prison since 2012. Tom Malinowski, who used to be the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at State Department, he and I formed the Egyptian Human Rights Caucus, mostly to try to get political prisoners. The political prisoners, by the way, were a young woman from Falls Church who ran a nonprofit for street children to give them bedding and food, and that got her, she and her husband and her in prison for 2 years. So this older gentleman who's like my age, 73, but much worse health, has been in prison since then. But again, through conversations on the diplomatic side, the same whole idea of being peacemakers everywhere we can, we actually got the country of Dominica, and I probably say it wrong, but it's spelled Dominica, not the Dominican Republic, tiny little thing in the Caribbean, to declare him a citizen and give him a passport. So that, because Egypt was determining you had to have someplace to go, and it couldn't come to the United States. He's still in prison, but now he's a citizen of Dominica with a passport, and we're still pushed on a daily basis to try to get him out. And then I had a fascinating thing just over this weekend, very much in the same theory of trying to use conflict resolution, peaceful asking respectfully to make things happen. A friend from the General Assembly in Martinsville, Virginia called because one of his friends, 59 years old, was vacationing in Italy last week, had a heart attack, and almost died. They were able to revive him, but not actually revive him. He's brain dead. No EEG is flat. So that's very sad. They're just south of Tuscany. So his wife went to the hospital with her living will and medical directive, and the Italians won't recognize him. So it's $150,000 to ship his living but brain dead body back to the United States. So once again, I do the logical thing is I called the ambassadors from Switzerland here. And I don't know if the transfer has happened yet, but they said, yes, if you move him to Lugano or Lausanne, we will unplug him. We don't think he will survive the ambulance trip for the 3 or 4 hours to do that, but that at least is happening. So that's a dark story, but yet again, a story of the fact that you can use diplomatic tools, especially conversation and friendship and trustworthiness, to solve all kinds of big problems and little problems. To become very personal, so I've been selling cars for 46 years. And one of the best parts about that was not the, having Linda give me $15,000 and drive away in a 1974 Volvo, whatever. Rather is the fact that you have service customers, which is really 95% of the business. So I've been cursed and yelled at so many times, and discovered that by far the best way to deal with that is when Dean Otherdam comes in and says, the wheel fell off my car on the way home from the service, is to repeat the entire story in his words to him after having taken extensive notes before you even start trying to fix it. That just the process of listening and repeating and understanding and being wholly empathetic completely changes the conversation and the solution. I have found that in my back pocket for years, I've said, well, Dean, what do you think is the fair resolution? Almost always the customer will ask for more than I'm willing to give because you've treated them fairly, and then you do the right thing, and then they're even happier. That on the hopeful side, let me end because it's coming close. I'd love to answer any questions if there are any. I hope you saw Peter Beinart's op-ed in the last couple of days, where he wrote about hope in Gaza and basically said, let's look at South Africa and how terrible it was there 20 or 25 years ago and how completely different it is now. Not that there isn't corruption and crime and things like that, but politically, we've moved way past apartheid. We now have a biracial government, a biracial nation that accepts each other. And if that can happen there, can it also happen in Gaza and in Israel? That you see again and again that not 2 million Gazans don't, culturally been taught that Israel is the enemy and to hate them. And the Israelis have been, learned that Hamas is a very dangerous being. But, you can imagine a world in which like the previous 1,000 years when Arabs and Jews lived side by side in that same land without the sign of the conflicts that you have there, that there is hopefulness when you move forward. I think it was in the same op-ed, he said, in India, you had this issue of the unwilling occupation, but you had a Gandhi. And in South Africa, you had a Mandela. Can we find somebody like that in the Palestinians that can rise up, make peace, renounce the Charter of Israel has no right to exist and the like. And then finally, the most encouraging thing that I've seen in the last couple of days about diplomacy and evolution and hope. And I have this naive belief that history has a direction, and that direction is forward. I can't prove it. I just believe it. Was this wonderful meme that you saw once with the Israeli flag projected onto the top of Brandenburg Gate, which is wonderful. But many pictures have shown up that underneath that same Brandenburg Gate with all the Nazi tanks rolling through it with all the Nazi flags and say, less than 100 years. We've gone from Hitler and Nazism to a Germany that actually stands together within Israel. So we have to cling to that and to Jimmy and Rosalynn's vision that it can be a different and much better world if we can commit ourselves to human rights, to moral values, to always trying to do the right thing, and to talking to each other.
I just wanted to say that the first Egyptian political prisoner you were referencing, her name is Aya Hijazi. She's an alumna of our program, and
oh, good.
We're just very grateful for your efforts to help get her released.
Well, Aya was the one that got us involved in it, and the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation on Human Rights. Kerry Kennedy's good friends. Thank you.